The morning light in our Seattle home usually felt like a promise, a soft, golden assurance that everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. But that Saturday, the light felt intrusive, almost mocking, as it cut through the bedroom curtains and landed on the empty space beside me. Elena was already up. I could hear the faint, rhythmic thud of her running shoes on the pavement outside, a sound that usually grounded me in our routine. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and felt the familiar, heavy silence of a house that had been feeling increasingly empty, even when we were both in it. I walked into the kitchen, the hardwood floor cooling under my bare feet. I grabbed my coffee mug, the one with the chipped rim she'd bought me on our first trip together, and let the heat seep into my palms. It was 8:30 a.m. She was supposed to be back from her run 20 minutes ago. I needed to clear the driveway. We had guests coming over in the evening, and my truck was blocked in by her white sedan. I stepped out, the air crisp and biting. I pulled my keys from my pocket and walked to her car. As I climbed into the driver's seat, the scent of her perfume hit me instantly. That familiar, light floral fragrance that was as much a part of her as her laugh. But there was something else, too. A faint, lingering note of something sharp and metallic, like expensive cologne. Not mine. I reached for the rearview mirror to adjust it, and my hand stopped in midair. Dangled from the stem of the mirror was a small, glossy plastic pass for the Sterling Heights Country Club. My heart gave a sudden, sickening lurch. I knew that place. It was the playground of the city's ultra-wealthy, a guarded fortress where memberships cost more than my annual salary. I sat there, the engine silent, the world around me beginning to warp. Elena had always been vocal about her disdain for the country club set. She called them corporate vampires and golf-obsessed relics. So why was a pass to their private parking lot hanging in her car? Why was she holding a key to a world she claimed to loathe? I reached up, my fingers trembling, and touched the smooth plastic. Felt impossibly heavy, like a lead weight pressing into my conscience. Was it possible? The distance that had been growing between us over the last 3 months, the late nights, the sudden preoccupation with her appearance, the way she would silence her phone when I entered the room. It all started to converge into a terrifying, singular explanation. I snapped a photo of the pass with my phone, the shutter click sounding like a gunshot in the quiet morning. I shoved it back, got out of the car, and pulled my truck out with a force that made the tires screech against the asphalt. By the time I walked back into the house, my resolve was hardening into a cold, jagged spike of fury. When she finally walked through the front door, she was flushed from her run, her hair loose and damp against her neck. She looked beautiful, the kind of vibrant, living beauty that made me ache with a love I no longer knew how to protect. She didn't notice the tension radiating off me until I held up the pass. Her face didn't crumble. It didn't even flush. It went completely still. She reached for it, her fingers brushing mine, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not guilt, but a terrifying, absolute fear. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice tight, barely above a whisper. "I found it in your car, Elena," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. "You told me you hated that place. You told me those people were pompous fools. So, explain to me why you're parking your car in their lot. Is it Vance? Are you seeing your boss?" She looked at me, and I saw a war being fought behind her eyes. A struggle between a truth she couldn't share and a lie she could no longer maintain. The air in the kitchen grew heavy, suffocating. Elena stood there, her chest still heaving from the run, the morning light catching the beads of sweat on her temple. She didn't reach for the pass again. She let her arms drop to her sides, a gesture of defeat that felt almost too rehearsed. The seconds ticked by, a long, agonizing stretch of silence where the only sound was the distant hum of the refrigerator. "It's not what you think," she finally said. Her voice wasn't defensive. It was flat, hollow. It was the voice of someone who had spent months rehearsing an explanation that she knew wouldn't be believed. "Then tell me what it is," I pressed, stepping closer. I wanted to see the cracks. I wanted her to break, to scream, to apologize, to do anything other than stand there with that expression of detached, weary resignation. Is it Vance? Have you been spending your business meetings on the golf course with him while I sat at home, thinking you were building a career? She looked away, focusing on the small, framed photo of us from our honeymoon that sat on the counter. I can't tell you, Mark. Not yet. If I tell you, it changes everything. For both of us. It's already changed, Elena, I shouted, the fury finally boiling over. I grabbed the pass from the counter and slammed it down. You've been hiding things for months. The late nights, the phone calls you step into the other room to take, the way you look at me like I'm a stranger. You think I'm stupid? You think I don't see the way this marriage is rotting from the inside out? She flinched as if I'd struck her. Her composure shattered, and for a split second, I saw a raw, desperate pain that looked far more like betrayal than guilt. I was trying to protect you, she whispered, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I was trying to fix it before you even knew there was a problem. I backed away, laughing a harsh, jagged sound. Protect me? The classic line of every betrayer in history. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I grabbed my keys, walked past her without another look, and went straight to the garage. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't be in that house, breathing the same air as her, listening to a script she'd clearly practiced. I drove for hours, aimlessly navigating the winding roads leading out of the city, my mind a chaotic storm of memories and fresh, stinging realizations. Every late night she had spent at the office now felt like a taunt. Every time she had told me she was tired and needed space, I now saw it as a calculated maneuver to keep me at a distance. I was a man who had been living in a house he thought he owned, only to find out he was a guest in someone else's life. By the time I pulled back into the driveway, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the lawn. The house was dark. When I walked inside, the silence was different. It felt finalized, a heavy, permanent stillness. I went to the bedroom, but she wasn't there. Her closet was partially open, and I saw that her suitcase, the one she took on those business trips, was gone. I stood in the center of the room, the anger slowly draining out, leaving behind a cold, hollow space where my heart used to be. I knew I couldn't keep playing this game. I couldn't go on living in a lie, waiting for the other shoe to drop. If she wouldn't tell me the truth, I would have to go out and find it myself. I sat down at her desk, turning on her laptop, the one she usually kept locked with a complex, rotating password, and started to look. I didn't care about dignity or boundaries anymore. I was a man who had lost his home, his trust, and his wife in the span of 12 hours. I opened her browser, checked her history, and started digging through every file, every document, every digital footprint she'd left behind. I was looking for proof, but what I found was a digital trail that made no sense. There were no romantic emails, no suggestive texts, no evidence of a secret life with Arthur Vance. Instead, there were thousands of pages of financial documents, legal consultations, and medical records that seemed entirely unconnected to the woman I knew. It was as if she were leading two separate, parallel lives, and neither of them involved an affair. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my pupils, feeling a strange, pulsating hum in my ears. The medical records weren't just random reports. They were detailed clinical notes, laboratory results, and oncology consultations, all dated over the last 4 months. The names weren't hers, or at least they were registered under an alias, but the patient history descriptions, the specific rare autoimmune condition mentioned, were identical to the symptoms Elena had been complaining about in passing, which I had foolishly dismissed as fatigue or work-related stress. My stomach churned. The late nights at the office, the exhaustion she wore like a second skin, the sudden, sharp silences. They weren't signs of a mistress or an affair. They were markers of a slow-motion catastrophe she was facing entirely on her own. I scrolled through a series of legal documents, my breath hitching as I realized these were trust fund structures and power of attorney forms being finalized in secret. She was systematically liquidating personal assets, turning them into protected funds that I wouldn't be able to touch if she was gone. She wasn't building a life with a lover. She was building a fortress for me to inhabit after she disappeared. The Sterling Heights Pass? I clicked on a folder labeled legal assets and found a correspondence with an estate lawyer regarding a high-stakes, private auction held at the country club. She had been attending these gatherings, not for golf or luxury, but to facilitate the anonymous sale of her family's private art collection, a collection I never knew existed, to pay for the experimental treatments that the insurance companies deemed experimental and refused to cover. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. Her disdain for the wealthy elite wasn't a mask. It was a survival strategy. She had been forced to enter a world she detested, playing the part of a corporate climber, simply to secure the funds necessary to buy herself more time. And Arthur Vance? He wasn't her lover. He was the executor of a complex financial arrangement she had negotiated to ensure the funds remained untaxable and untraceable, a favor she had secured at the cost of her own reputation among her peers. I slumped back in the chair, the weight of my own arrogance crushing me. While I was busy playing the part of the jilted, suspicious husband, constructing elaborate scenarios of betrayal, she was fighting a war against her own biology, all while trying to spare me the sight of her decline. I had been so obsessed with my own hurt, so trapped in the narrative of my own victimhood, that I had failed to see the woman I loved literally wasting away in front of me. I heard the front door open, the sound echoing through the house like a thunderclap. My heart froze. She was home. I quickly shut the laptop, the screen going dark, and stood up, my pulse hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window, seeing a man who was utterly, devastatingly hollow. I had betrayed her not with a physical affair, but with a total, absolute failure of trust. I had doubted her the moment things got difficult, while she had been shouldering the weight of the world to keep my future secure. I walked toward the hallway, my legs feeling like they were carved from stone. I had to see her. I had to find a way to tell her that I knew, that I understood, and that I was the most pathetic, narrow-minded man on the planet. But as I reached the door, I stopped. I could hear her voice, low, strained, and filled with a pain that she had carefully suppressed around me for months. She was speaking to someone on the phone, her voice barely a tremor in the stillness. I can't go back, Arthur. The tests. They aren't good. I think the time for hiding this from Mark has finally run out. I remained frozen in the hallway, the hardwood floor biting into my feet, every muscle in my body locked in a state of agonizing paralysis. The voice coming from the kitchen, strained, brittle, and impossibly thin, was not the voice of the woman I thought I had been married to for 6 years. It was the voice of a woman who had been standing at the edge of an abyss, looking down into the darkness, all while pretending to plan our Saturday lake trip. I heard the phone click off, followed by the soft, rhythmic sound of a chair being pushed back. My heart felt as though it were being squeezed in a tightening fist. I had spent days building a monument to my own resentment, feeding on the bile of a manufactured betrayal, while she had been fighting for her very life, silently counting the remaining grains of sand in her hourglass. The sheer, crushing weight of my own failures washed over me, a tidal wave of realization that left me breathless. I stepped into the room. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her head bowed over her folded hands, the dim evening light turning her silhouette into something frail and ephemeral. She looked up when she heard me, her eyes widening in that familiar, defensive flash of alarm, before she caught sight of my face. She froze. There was no room left for the lies she had prepared, no space for the polished corporate mask she had been forced to wear. "Mark?" she whispered, the name catching in her throat like jagged glass. I didn't answer with words. I walked over, pulled the chair out, and sat down opposite her, reaching out to cover her cold, trembling hands with my own. The moment our skin touched, she didn't pull away. Instead, she collapsed forward, her forehead resting against our joined hands, and the sound that escaped her was a sob so deep and fractured it seemed to tear the very silence apart. I didn't try to explain how I knew. I didn't try to defend the hours I spent hacking into her privacy or the vitriol I had spewed in my own ignorance. In that moment, the why and the how were entirely irrelevant. I listened to the story I had been too self-absorbed to notice, the months of doctor's appointments I had dismissed, the hidden exhaustion I had attributed to her ambition, and the terrifying, lonely reality of a diagnosis that she had been told was terminal. She hadn't been distancing herself because she loved me less. She had been trying to detach herself to soften the eventual blow of her absence. "I didn't want you to see this," she finally managed to choke out, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want to be the woman who needed to be taken care of. I wanted to be the partner you fell in love with until the very end." I held her, the world outside the kitchen walls falling away into insignificance. The house, the driveway, the petty jealousies, the anger. It all felt like a fever dream I was finally waking up from. I realized then that my life hadn't been a tragedy of betrayal, but a tragedy of intimacy. A failure to truly see the person sitting across from me. We didn't talk about the lawyer or the country club, not then. We didn't talk about the months of deception. We simply sat in the quiet, and for the first time in an eternity, the distance between us evaporated. I had come looking for the truth, expecting it to be a weapon I could use to settle the score, but it had turned out to be a mirror. It showed me exactly who I had been, and more importantly, it showed me the person I had to become if I was going to be the man she deserved for the time we had left. The morning light would return, and with it, the cold, harsh realities of medical bills, experimental treatments, and a future that had been stolen from us. But the house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt heavy, filled with the terrifying, beautiful urgency of a life that was finally, truly being lived. I had the truth, and though it had burned my old world to the ground, it was the only thing that would allow us to endure what was coming next. The days that followed were a surreal blur of sterile hospital waiting rooms and the rhythmic, hollow beeping of life-monitoring machines. The house, once our shared sanctuary, had transformed into a staging ground for a battle I hadn't realized we were fighting until it was almost too late. I stopped going to my job. The projects and deadlines that had once occupied my hours now seemed like the trivial concerns of a man inhabiting a parallel dimension. My entire universe had shrunk to the four walls of our home and the immediate, urgent needs of the woman who had spent months protecting me from the truth of her fading life. Every morning, I found myself tracing the lines of her face as she slept, terrified that one day I might wake up and find the space beside me cold. I had traded my suspicious, detective-like obsession for a new, quieter kind of vigilance. Watching for her tremors, timing her medication, and memorizing the way her breathing changed when the pain finally became too much to mask behind a smile. The guilt was a constant, sharp companion, pricking at me whenever I looked at the small, turquoise Tiffany box I had kept tucked away in my drawer. I had been so convinced that her distance was a result of a cold heart, failing to realize it was the result of a terrified one. We talked more in those 2 weeks than we had in the previous 2 years. We spoke about the life we wouldn't have, the children we'd never raise, and the small, mundane dreams that now carried the heavy weight of impossibility. I discovered that the Sterling Heights secret was just the tip of a much larger, darker iceberg. She had been meeting with a palliative care specialist and a hospice coordinator, all while keeping the appointments hidden under the guise of work calls. When I finally found the hospice literature buried in her nightstand, I didn't get angry. I didn't feel the surge of betrayal that had driven me to her office weeks before. I simply sat on the edge of the bed and wept, finally understanding the profound, lonely courage it took to face the end of everything while actively trying to make life easier for the person you love. One afternoon, while the sun was bathing the living room in that same golden light that had mocked me on that fateful Saturday, she looked at me from the sofa. She looked thinner, her skin pale, but her eyes held a clarity that was almost frightening. "I don't regret it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the air conditioner. "The lying, the secrets. I don't regret any of it, Mark. If I had told you back then, you would have spent these last months grieving me while I was still standing here. I wanted us to be us for as long as I could hold on to it." I leaned my head against the back of the sofa, closing my eyes. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't an act I performed for her. It was something I had to do for myself, to let go of the anger I had cultivated while she was dying. I had spent months feeling like a victim of her secrecy, when all along I had been the beneficiary of her final, most selfless act of love. The reality of her condition was worsening, Every day was a steeper climb than the last, and the medical bills had begun to pile up on the dining room table like a mountain of unsolvable problems. But for the first time, the mountain didn't feel insurmountable. We were facing it together, in the silence, in the medication schedules, and in the quiet, desperate moments where we held on to each other as if we were the only two people left on Earth. Our life had been stripped of its facade, and in the wreckage, I found a level of intimacy that I wouldn't have believed possible back when I was checking her rearview mirror for clues. It was a brutal, honest, and devastating reality, but it was ours. The transition from the world of the living into the quiet, heavy atmosphere of hospice care felt like a slow descent into a different state of reality. The hospital equipment that had turned our home into a sterile environment eventually gave way to the soft, muted comfort of a hospice bed. The chaos of my initial suspicions, the burning need for answers, and the cold, sharp edges of my resentment had long since dissolved, replaced by a profound, pervasive stillness. We existed in a space where time was no longer measured in appointments or deadlines, but in the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest and the soft, lingering quality of the light as it changed throughout the day. The financial burden, which once seemed like a mountain I had to conquer alone, became just another part of the background, something I handled with the automatic, emotionless efficiency of a machine. The trust fund, the sold art, the complex legal maneuvering, all of it felt like a ghost story from a man I didn't recognize anymore. I spent my hours reading to her, or sometimes just sitting by the window, watching the seasons bleed into one another. I had stopped trying to fix anything. I had stopped trying to understand the why. I was learning, with agonizing slowness, the art of simply being. One evening, as the sky turned a deep, bruised violet, she reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were impossibly thin, almost translucent, but her grip held a surprising, focused strength. She didn't speak for a long time, and I held my breath, afraid that a single sound might shatter the fragile peace of the moment. "You know," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, "I spent so long being afraid that the secret would consume us. I thought the lie was a wall that would keep the world out, but it was just a cage that kept me from you." I squeezed her hand. My heart ached with a familiar, deep-seated ache that had become my constant shadow. "You didn't keep the world out, Elena. You kept the truth away from me. You didn't give me the chance to stand with you." She smiled, a weak, fleeting expression that reached her eyes for the first time in months. "I had to be the one to carry it, Mark. If you had known, you would have stopped living your life to watch me fade. I needed you to be you. I needed you to keep going." That was the final, brutal truth of our tragedy. Her deception wasn't an act of malice. It was a desperate, misguided attempt to preserve a version of me that didn't yet know how to carry the weight of her death. I realized then that forgiveness was not about the secret itself, but about acknowledging the terrible, selfless love that had necessitated it. When she passed, it wasn't the explosive, dramatic finale I had once feared. It was quiet, a gentle exhaling, a soft dissolution of the person I had spent 6 years trying to understand. The silence that followed was different from the one I had known in the empty house weeks prior. It was heavy, yes, but it was also clean. The secrets were gone. The deception had vanished. All that remained was the raw, undeniable reality of her absence and the haunting, beautiful clarity of what we had finally managed to share in those last, desperate weeks. I am left with a life that feels like an unfamiliar landscape, a map I have to learn to navigate alone. I kept the Tiffany bracelet. I kept the memories of the quiet nights by the window, and I keep the knowledge that love, in its most extreme form, can be a lonely, terrifying, and ultimately, a transformative burden. The story has reached its end. I am a man who started this journey searching for a betrayal, and instead, found a depth of love that destroyed me just as completely. For those of you who have followed this, how do you redefine yourself after you've lost the person who was the center of your universe? How do you keep the truth from becoming a weight you carry forever? Let me know your thoughts, and thank you for listening.